how do you respond? How do you react? How do you behave in the crisis? That really influences their perception, you know? I think everybody understands that sometimes mistakes happen, things happen.
Yeah.
Plants burn down and it messes up your supply chain, those kinds of things. But how you respond to that and the public face you put on and the way you the way you communicate about it really does have a big influence on the lasting impression.
No more excuses. No more branding band-aids. The art of positioning. Let's freaking go. Now's my time and I won't hesitate. You've built a business that pays salaries, wins contracts, and keeps clients coming back. But lately, the phone's quieter, referrals slowed, and your sales team's chasing leads that never call back. Dropping $20K on Facebook ads and a shiny new website has only led your marketing expenses to increase, but not your revenue. You've likely blended in with your competition, and a fresh position and strategy to implement that consistently throughout your business will fix that. Check out the episode notes to find out more. This episode was sponsored by Dealfront, and in a few minutes I'll share just why they're far useful than LinkedIn Sales Nav. So today's episode is about tackling crises and keeping your brand equity safe regardless of what gets thrown at your business. One of our guests is Oliver Aust, who's navigated Fortune 500 crises, written 4 books, hosts a leading podcast and newsletter, and he's planning to march 100 kilometers. Are you hunting for the pot of gold under the rainbow? Because damn.
No, just like a friend just said, hey, I want to walk 100 kilometers. And I said, cool, I'll join you. And that was that conversation. So it's a year from now, or next May. So I feel like I have some time to get into shape and, get those hiking boots on and learn how to actually walk 100 kilometers, which I've never done. So we'll see how that goes.
Like, how does one prepare for walking 100 kilometers? You just start walking longer and longer periods?
Yeah, essentially, yes.
Damn. Okay. Just taking notes here. Not that I'm gonna walk 100. No, I'll vote myself out here. And we've also got Gordon Firemark in the other hot seat. He's been helping creatives, artists, and entrepreneurs, and keeping podcasters out of legal trouble for over 30 years. Call me. And between a busy law practice, he's teaching law at several schools. Did you find a hack to 40-hour days to fit all that in? Like what?
I am often sleep deprived, but no, I sort of time block. So if I'm teaching, I'll try to do all my classes on the same day so that it's just the one day of the week, those kinds of things. But it is definitely a juggling act.
That is incredible. I mean, but between the both of you walking 100 Ks and, lack of sleep, it's fantastic. So getting right off the bat, let's clear this theory once and for all. What are your two stances on there's no such thing as bad publicity?
Well, I that's a nice quotation, but I don't think in reality it plays out that way. There are things that can just be devastating to a brand, a business, a reputation. We just had one in recent weeks involving the kiss cam at the Coldplay concert, and not the world crisis, world altering kind of a crisis, but it's the brand had to deal with it pretty quickly, didn't they?
Mm-hmm.
That's right. I agree. There is such a thing as bad publicity. So if you're an airline and you have a crash, you get a shit ton of publicity, but it's all bad news because that is your single point of failure. And while a lot of publicity, American Eagle, whatever, is good for the share price, good for sales, if you hit that single point of failure and customer trust is essentially gone, then you have a real problem. You can turn it around with the right crisis communication, so what you do and what you say in a crisis, but it is a real challenge and you would rather not have that.
Yeah, exactly. And, that goes into talking about like different types of brand crises. Like what are the different types that we can, or businesses can prepare for, like, going from kiss cams or cancel culture, Me Too movements. Like, what are the kinds of things that you've seen or things that businesses can look for?
Generally, it's, they're operational crises and reputational crises. So kiss cam, that sort of thing, that's purely reputational, nothing to do with the operation of the business. And then there are the operational challenges. So for instance, you have a plant where all your widgets are coming from and the plant burns down, then you have a real operational challenge. Or you have a cyber attack and your cyber defenses get breached. Now that can then turn into reputational crisis. Not going to too technical here, but it starts as something operational. Criminals have breached our cyber defenses, but if you don't handle that loss of customer data well, it very well becomes a reputational crisis. So I would think in these two sort of categories, broad buckets, if you like, in terms of crises. Is it operational? Something happened to how we do the business? Or is it reputational, where it's often the leadership that does something a little cheeky or plain wrong that could get them into, so between getting divorced and getting into jail, that's often the reputational part.
Gordon, any thoughts on like?
I didn't have much to add. I think that's quite right. I mean, in my work, almost all of the crises we encounter are reputational crises. It's the entertainment industry. It's so dependent on public perception and public whim, really, of who are we going to like this week and who are we not going to this week. The Me Too issues, of course, of a few years back are still very vivid memories for us. And, all it took was an accusation. It didn't even have to be a real misdoing or wrongdoing to bring about a real crisis.
I mean, this looks very much into changing viewpoints. And I see some businesses, they have aligned with a certain political stance, or they've got a certain viewpoint, say, for example, towards like LGBTQ, these kinds of things. And big part of that is if you change, or if the climate changes, do you want to stick with that? If you don't stick with that, like, how is that going to affect, like how I recently saw with Target and their changes of views around LGBTQ, stopping their donations, and that reflects, people see that.
I think a lot of what we have to concern ourselves with isn't so much the crisis itself, the fact that something has happened, or Target making its decisions about DEI and those kinds of things. I think what the audience is really, the consuming public is really looking at is, how do you respond? How do you react? How do you behave in the crisis? That really influences their perception. I think everybody understands that sometimes mistakes happen, things happen.
Yeah.
Plants burn down and it messes up your supply chain, those kinds of things. But how you respond to that, and the public face you put on, and the way you just the way you communicate about it, really does have a big influence on the lasting impression that's made.
Yeah. I think it's important to distinguish between, let's say, the brand positioning and a crisis. And some of the things you alluded to, those are about brand positioning. And we think about these big companies, they've probably been around for decades, and their brand positioning has evolved over the decades. Otherwise, they couldn't survive, right? If Procter & Gamble would advertise washing powder the same way they did in the 1950s, or Camel would advertise cigarettes like they did in the 1960s, it wouldn't work, right? So they have to evolve, and they keep readjusting the brand positioning in order to stay relevant, top of mind, and even acceptable to consumers. Now, a crisis is something else, and sometimes brand positioning gone wrong can lead to a crisis. But I would be careful to mix these two up, because all brands have to position themselves, whereas crisis is often something that happens externally and sometimes originates internally when the marketing department makes really bad judgment, or something else happens, see above Coldplay concert.
That is a really interesting point, and it's something that I've been talking about a lot recently, and that is to avoid taking a big jump and like going for a rebrand instead of repositioning, is what you've just been mentioning, how these companies, they evolve as things change in the environment. Whereas brands that have gone into like a whole rebrand, like take, for example, Jaguar recently, right? It's just like, hey, let's just change completely what we're known for, completely, the face of the image, things that people have started to become associated to that business or to that brand. It has that effect. Have you guys seen similar sort of instances, or what do you guys think about that?
Well, I have to wonder, in the case of Jaguar in particular, was this rebranding, repositioning in response to crisis? Crisis may be too strong of a word, but of the brand encountering enough challenges that it was just time to shake everything up completely and make that change. Was that a crisis, or was it, or is the rebranding potentially leading to a crisis? That's a big question.
Agree. I think they probably had to make a radical shift in order to survive. I mean, at least that looks like from the outside, because as a brand it was, and as a business it was in decline. It doesn't have economies of scale. It's neither super luxury nor is it affordable. It's kind of in between. Is a very difficult branding position to be in. You can only spend so many years essentially living off your British heritage brand. At some point you have to move things into the 21st century. And while I'm an admirer of the brand, I agree radical things had to happen. If that is the answer, I don't know. I think the jury is still out, but I'm sure they're listening to their customers, and probably what they presented a while ago will evolve when it actually, hits the showrooms at some point. So I'm suspending judgment here.
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, so with further context, what I understand about the situation is that, of course, their sales have been dropping. They weren't reaching the younger audience, so like Gen Z, Gen Alpha, and they saw that, again, like what you said, is the way to get people talking. And yet, the thing is, there was that disconnect of that audience, or that that loyalty that's been built up over decades, where people are like, I'm not buying this anymore because this is no longer what I resonate with. Say for example, I was talking on a different podcast where they were like, yeah, so did you see that Kia changed their logo? And I didn't even know if it was a Kia. It's like, is this a new car brand? See, like that, I think, is a very dangerous move, because you're losing that association.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's always high risk, high reward. It can go terribly wrong, or it can go terribly right. Usually companies do it when they have to, or they feel they have to. There's some unforced errors too, but generally speaking, companies rebrand, reposition because the market, the world is moving on. And if they don't, then they become irrelevant. And that's what they're all panicking about. And then they hire an expensive agency, and sometimes good things happen and sometimes it backfires.
Yeah. And okay, I mean, talking about these backfires, what kind of impacts can we see? So say, for example, we're talking about like the value, the reputation, or, Gordon, in your case, like if there's like a legal battle, what kind of damage have you seen happen to brands because of that?
The legal battle, often if it's a very public legal battle, it will carry the potential of undermining trust, undermining confidence in the brand, or really just, rendering some portion of the marketplace angry at the brand for the way they've handled the legal issue. And some of that is about the public's ignorance of the process as well sometimes, but when you have a brand that encounters whatever the legal issue might be, oftentimes you don't have much choice but to pursue the action. Either it's an economic inevitability, or in the case of brands in particular with trademark law, we have an obligation to police our trademarks and do something to protect them, even when the potential harm or the thing we're reacting to is relatively minor. But often a small infraction has to lead to a big response, and that response is what then generates that reputational harm that Oliver was referring to.
I think that also can come back, like, you might be able to leverage that. So say, for example, if we have there's a legal battle or there's something going on that we're responding to, that we can take it and turn it so that it is actually supporting the brand instead of, it's building on that reputation.
And, in this day and age of everything can be posted on the internet within minutes of its arrival in your inbox, there have been a number of instances of I'll say smart companies and their lawyers. Look, if you have to send a cease and desist letter, do it in a way that is gentle and maybe amusing. There's often been a lot of tongue-in-cheek content in these cease and desists from those firms and brands that I think it plays to the audience's appreciation for a sense of humor, the little tongue-in-cheek thing. Yeah, we have to make you stop, but here's how we're going to do it, and let's make everybody laugh while we do. So that's one approach.
Would you say? Can I ask a question? I'm really interested in your experience here, Gordon, because we had the intersection of the court of public opinion and the courts of law, and would you say that what happens in the court of public opinion impacts what happens in the court of law, which should of course be above board and super rational, but I suspect that's not always the case.
I think that the court of public opinion, there are situations where the lawyers in court have to play to the court of public opinion, and it's a fine, a high wire kind of an act of keeping decorum in the courtroom. Otherwise the judge isn't going to have things. It won't go well for you if the judge is unhappy. But at the same time, what the public hears about what went on in court today is important for the long-term success of the company's products and services and the brand. So I think it does. Objectively, I don't always think it should, but I think the bigger the litigation, the more likely you have a PR team that is sitting in the second chair with the lawyers.
Right. I'm thinking Sam Bankman-Fried, for instance, who went on a PR tour before his court appearances, sure, which, judging from afar, but didn't go too well for him.
Well, and as a lawyer, especially in the criminal context, I would be very cautious about encouraging a defendant to be very public about things, because what you say can be used against you. And if you want to stay out of jail, if protecting the brand is more important, maybe that's a calculation you make.
So is it sometimes a case of balancing whether it's you staying out of jail or your brand, surviving through this?
Well, I don't know that in the criminal. I don't do criminal law at all. I wouldn't presume to make a recommendation along those lines, but sometimes the client feels I need to do this for the long-term benefit, even if it's going to be a hit now. I mean, you saw Fox News pay out many millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to deal with a libel, the alleged libel. Well, it was a libel that they made, and they chose to settle the case because obviously at some point it was in their financial as well as brand interests to make the lawsuit go away. Yeah. I guess, so.
Makes a lot of sense. And if I can ask a follow-up question, sorry, Beatrice, your podcast.
It works. Yeah.
What I find fascinating is, yes, you can go out on a PR spree and essentially, talk your way into prison like Sam Bankman-Fried. You can also say nothing and you end up in the same position because you get crucified in the court of public opinion, and whereas the court of law is years away. And I think of cases like Boeing, where the CEO had to leave. When you think about the 737 MAX crashes they had, they didn't say anything. Terrible communication strategy they had. After a while, they did the right thing and started talking about it and explained their position. However, by that time, it had tanked and the company is still recovering many years later. The CEO had to leave. I'm sure, any communication specialist inside said the right thing, but wasn't listened to. So it just shows that balance or that interplay between the legal and the communication side is so important in a crisis. And we can't say this is right or that is right. It's really contextual. What are you dealing with in that particular situation? Which is why I always recommend talk to each other beforehand, right? When you think about a company's communication strategy, make sure that comms and legal talk and have a common approach. Otherwise, both sides are talking to the CEO. The CEO is like, oh, I don't know what to do, potentially listening too much to the lawyers. Sorry, Gordon. Because, rather not say anything, could be used against me. But then if a company has a serious issue and doesn't talk, doesn't explain, doesn't apologize, you have a real problem at your hands.
Well, there's another layer to this that is important to remember too, and it's the idea of sort of strategy by committee is always a risky thing. And I suspect in a company like the situation with Boeing, some of that paralysis or inability to react was because there was a board of directors that was coming in and CEO knows his job's on the line. The board's going to make some decisions. So, sometimes the nothing happening is a matter of that's because nobody's able to make a decision without running it up a flagpole. I think agility in these situations is probably a most important trait.
Yeah. Agility, leadership, and, before anything happens, to have those lines of communications and at least a baseline of understanding. That's important.
Yeah.
A clear direction in terms of which way to go. And that's exactly what we're about to go into in this second part of the conversation, where it's like, okay, these are the issues that can come up. Let's look at how can businesses tackle this? But I'm going to take a moment here to share comparing LinkedIn Sales Navigator and DealFront. Now, Sales Navigator has recently been promoting that you're able to access signals like recent hires, job adverts, and the number of employees on LinkedIn. And that's great, but that only goes so far. DealFront has given me the access to filtering this, as well as further signals like press releases and revenue, as well as additional ways to reach outside of LinkedIn. And that's why they're topping my tools list. Use the link in the episode description to access your free trial and an extra 10% off just for the Art of Positioning listeners like you. And don't forget to hit those like, share, and subscribe buttons if you're enjoying this episode. So back onto how to handle crises when they come. Now, Oliver, I want to pull out something that you just mentioned before there about lawyers driving crisis responses in messages. Between the both of you, what are your thoughts here about how messaging or how responses should come when these crises happen?
Yeah, I can start. So obviously the level of litigation, etc., depends on the country, so we shouldn't forget that. And the US may be a little special case, but just that aside. Now, I have a simple formula how to deal with crisis communications. Rule of thumb, the AAA, not the triple D, stands for acknowledge, apologize, and act. What you don't want to do is deny, diminish, deflect. So what should I do? Acknowledge this is happening. That's the first thing. And you should do this very quickly, because if something bad's happening in your arena and you're not out there saying, yes, this happened, instead maybe pushing out marketing messages. So stop the marketing message, acknowledge there's something happening. Second is apologize. And an apology is not an admission of guilt in the legal sense. They're two completely different things. So if I step on your toe, Beatrice, I'd say, oh, I'm sorry, but doesn't mean I admit to battery or something, right? So I just say sorry. So if I did something wrong, something bad happened, I say, oh, I'm sorry, and we then go to act. That's the third A, meaning we obviously want to make sure that we mitigate whatever happened, and we also want to ensure this doesn't happen again. So that's important. And as Gordon said earlier, it really depends how you deal with this crisis, whether your reputation goes up or reputation goes down. We all acknowledge that bad things happen to good people, right? Things happen, people make mistakes. If I acknowledge this and apologize and say, actually, here's what I'm doing so this never happens again, and this is how I'll make it up to you, we are relatively, actually positively surprised that we can build trust with such a reaction, because I now know as a customer, for instance, that even if things go wrong, they will make it right. And that's extremely powerful.
I think, and Oliver, I'm interested in your take on this, but I think there's a fourth A that goes at the beginning. And sometimes it's possible when a company or a brand has access to, let's face it, more data than the consuming public or the market. Anticipation is another component of this. If you can see a problem coming down the pike, there's a lot that can be done about it before it becomes a crisis, before it becomes something that you have to react to in the moment. And I think that anticipatory reaction or action is another important component.
I rewrite my books. This is awesome. I love it.
and I think that's what PR professionals can be really good at if they have the data that the brand has. And oftentimes I think one of the mistakes companies make is keeping everything too tightly buttoned up. Mm. And the folks that are responsible for the communication, and sometimes the folks that are responsible for the legal reactions as well, don't know about what's happening until it's already happened.
Yeah, exactly. And then, you have to communicate like a human being. Often you see these releases and they sound like a corporate press release because that's what they are. And if you put that out on X or LinkedIn or whatever, people, that's a social network. People want to hear from people. They want to hear it in a human voice. And what we mustn't forget is that a crisis is always an evolving story, a story that's in the making. It's not a rational, these are the factual things that happen. These are factual things that we're doing about it. It's very much that evolving story, which means that the question is, who's the villain in the story? And even if you're the victim, right? Let's say you had a cyber attack. Clearly you're the victims, but then the customers are also the victims. And they're like, who's to blame for this? And you have a short time window to ensure that you don't become the villain, right? You quickly move from victim to villain in this evolving story. So you always have to think in these terms in a crisis situation and think, what kind of story do people tell themselves about this? And social media is good to, feel the pulse in terms of what story is evolving, and then ensure that you ideally shape that narrative in order to not become the villain, but become the person who, or the organization that actually puts things right.
So from what you guys are saying, it sounds like it's important to define somebody within the business that's going to handle any kinds of crises, and also at the same time make sure that they're seeing everything in the update that's going on in the business. So say, for example, there's a marketing campaign, or there's a goal, there's a direction, or there's feedback, say, for example, on the customer service side, like to have that communication there with everybody in the team. Is that the right understanding?
I think well-informed is well-armed, and that's the point. Whoever it is that's going to be the face of the brand, the face of the company in the situation, obviously needs to be well-informed, but also the people who are advising that person need to be well-informed.
And well-trained, I would add, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a really good question, Beatrice. Who's the face of the business, of the organization when things go wrong? And it depends on the type of crisis and the severity of the crisis. If something really, really serious happens, then must be the CEO, right? To me, there's no doubt in my mind. If it's, let's say, a cyber issue, a technical issue, it could be the CTO if that person's trained and good. If it's operation, maybe it's the COO. So there are different options, but it needs to be someone very senior and someone who really speaks for the organization. It can't be spokesman number 3 who's sent out, as the messenger to die in this crisis. So you can't use people to shield the leadership. You have to face the music, and you have to go out there and actually, explain what's happening. It's really, really important, because otherwise the people who are the victims of the crisis don't feel taken seriously.
So would it be a mistake, say, for example, something happens and then you're like, oh no, what do I do? And reach out to an external third-party crisis person, be like, hey, help me. Like, is that too late, or are there other ways to approach this?
So go
ahead.
So you should not call someone you don't know in the event of a crisis. half the battle is won before. Yes, anticipation, and even before that, of course, prevention, and having a proper crisis playbook in place. Usually large organizations have two types of crisis playbooks. One is sort of, let's say, business continuity. If the server explodes, how do we ensure that we can continue our business? The other one is the crisis communications part. So what do we actually say when these scenarios happen, at least in the first instance, to then actually dive deep and understand what's going on. So, and then you need the messengers who have been well trained. So that's very important. And I wouldn't recommend going to an outside person, even someone like me or someone like Gordon, and let them speak on your behalf. It should be the leadership of the business, but they should be prepared and they should be trained to do this. Otherwise, things can go seriously wrong, as we've seen in certain crises. Tony Hayward comes to mind at BP, the Gulf spill. Is it called American Gulf now? I think so. The spill, if you remember. And one of the reasons why he was sacked is that essentially he said, yeah, I want my life back. And this is something you can't do in a crisis, to be and appear selfish. In a crisis, you need to be altruistic. We're going to pay these people. We want to make things right. We're going to, yes, it doesn't matter what it costs. Whatever it takes, we're going to make it right. That's the right kind of message. Not, I want my life back because I'm working quite a lot and it's really stressful for me, right? The rich person was other people losing their livelihood. I give this example because the BP example is so obvious, and what was wrong with it is so obvious. So never be selfish or appear selfish in a crisis. Make sure that you always appear to be altruistic, so you're not the villain of the story.
It really is about trust, isn't it? I mean, at every level. And so the moment you bring in an outsider, or the moment the person who's speaking for the company is showing signs of interests other than the audience interest, you undermine that trust.
So how would we go about this training that you mentioned? Or, training is one part. The other part is like the playbook. How do we approach that? Is that something that, when you have a certain number of people on your team, you're like, okay, now we need to start like yearly training, or what is your recommendation for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you start with the manual, the playbook. That is the beginning, because you need to actually test this in a simulation. So first step is you have to have that in place. What we do and what we say in case of X, Y, and Z. Then you usually bring in the whole communications team and you practice that with them, and then you go to the leadership, because you want the communications team to look competent and good in front of the leadership as well. So you don't want them to practice in front of their bosses. That is not good for internal trust building between comms and the leadership. So the last step is to involve the leadership, and I would recommend you do this every 6 months, because threats change, people change in organizations. So if you do it once a year, it can be a little thin if things really happen. So I would recommend every 6 months, and to really train this. How do we do this? Usually with simulations. We say, hey, this terrible thing just happened. Deal with it, right? And we have obviously ways to make this very lifelike. And then after a couple of hours, say, hey, this terrible escalation just happened. What do you do now? And then we simulate interviews. We doorstep people. We put cameras in their face and try to make them sweat and see how they deal with it under pressure. Because if they can't deal with it in a simulation, in a meeting room among colleagues, you don't really put them out in front of the wolves if it comes to that. And then they usually realize and say, okay, I do need a bit more training. I do need maybe one-on-one training. I want to really understand how I deal with this under pressure and what techniques I can apply in order to not say a terrible sentence which can undermine everything.
Say, for example, you're looking at building this playbook. It's currently blank. How are ways that we can understand what are things that we could be including, like the potential dangers, the potential crises that could come up, to list, okay, these are the crises, and then we can this is the play for each one of them. Mm-hmm. How do we define those?
Yeah. So we call this a vulnerability analysis, and essentially we have, this is 4 quadrants where we say, is this likely or unlikely to happen? And then is it severe if this happens, or is it not severe? And essentially you see there are things that are very likely but not that bad and we can probably deal with them. But some cases are very likely, but also very impactful. So we want to prioritize those. But also the things that have a massive impact, but are unlikely, those are also important to think about. So for instance, COVID, right? When it happened, I was like, oh, no one could see this coming. So no, but it should be a scenario that you can't operate your business for whatever reason needs to be a scenario you would have thought about. And I come from the airline industry, I was communications director for big airlines. So I know this, and we knew this. This is always a scenario you prepare for, because the regulator could say, oh, your aircraft, you can't fly them anymore because we found this faulty part, and then you have nothing. And actually, I was in a situation like this when in 2010, this unpronounceable Icelandic volcano broke out, and we had to ground the whole fleet, right? And had zero business from one day to the next. So this can happen to a business, whether it's a virus or a volcano, it doesn't really matter. You have to think this through and say, okay, this is low probability, but when it happens, it's really severe. And then you have things that every company needs to include. Cyber attacks, for instance, they're on the rise, can happen to anyone. The CEO, shenanigans, right? See above. Why? Because companies usually don't, when you ask them what gives you sleepless nights, they're not going to say, oh, our boss. No one's going to say that, right? So you as an external advisor have to say, this is always part of the playbook, because this can happen. You don't know, what unfortunate thing may emerge on social media next week. You just don't know, but it happens enough so that we want to take part of it. So there are some things that could happen to anyone, and there's some things that are very specific to the business, and you want to have like the top 5 scenarios at least thought through, and you group them together, right? So the operational stuff and the cyber stuff and the reputational stuff and things specific to the industry, maybe supply chain is vulnerable, etc. So you think this through, and then you come up with, okay, what are we going to do about this? How are we going to say about this?
Do you have a similar sort of approach from a legal perspective, Gordon, or do you see this differently?
From a legal perspective, it's usually a reactive kind of a thing. There are some things we do in the transactional end of things that are anticipating problems, but typically that's just minimizing our liability when the problem arises, not necessarily spinning it. And some lawyers are really good at the PR side of it, the anticipating the public perception. I would say most really aren't. And in fact, we've seen a lot of examples of lawyers causing the crisis, with our company is issuing new terms of use or terms of service or privacy policy, and then the community is up in arms because the lawyers were trying to protect the company and didn't really think about the business consequences of, let's say, we own your stuff kinds of messages, particularly in the social media space. So I think the best lawyers can do is like I said, minimize liability and try to do so with the smallest footprint possible.
Well, I mean, that certainly sounds like another area to put into the playbook, is like looking at what miscommunications can happen like within the team or even through third parties as well.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily characterize what I was describing in the particulars of this terms of use scenario. Mm-hmm. The challenge is the lawyers are doing their job. They're trying to maximize the protection for the company, and in some regards following some best practices. But then if you're not really tuned into what this company's specifics, relationships with its clients and customers is, you might just overstep something. And oftentimes, because it's in the legal language that most people don't bother to read anyway, the folks that are the non-lawyers in the company that are asked to review this stuff may not really understand the nuance and the consequence until some smart person out on the internet says, hey, look what they're trying to do. Can you believe this? How terrible is, and there's the reputational harm. Oh, they don't care about their customers. They just care about their bottom line. And then you've got a crisis. So
that's why you want to sensitize people across an organization what could trigger a crisis, from customer service to legal. I mean, there's so many origins of a potential crisis, and the better people understand it, the more anticipatory lead time you get before the crisis breaks, if any. Or you can maybe potentially even avoid it, right?
So from all these different areas, this seems like a lot, coming at it from, management perspective, how do you focus on what area that you should be doing that training on? Or do you like pick a day and be like, okay, we're going to pick a random page from this playbook and this is what we're going to double down on?
It's usually in collaboration with the client, right? So we usually come with some ideas, they come with some ideas, but there's often something that causes them sleepless nights right now. And that's something we focus on. Then we create a scenario that's very detailed and quite, we can be very creative. I had George Clooney in scenarios. I had, all sorts of fun things you can do, which makes it more entertaining and people get more engaged, but also still very serious. And essentially, so you agree on the broad topic, the area you want to cover, and then it's up to us to fill it with life and with details. But it's in collaboration because we want this to be, you get maybe 2 a year, sometimes 1. You want them to be useful as possible for the client.
At what point in having a business should having a playbook be mandatory? Like 1 year in business, or you just, as soon as you start, like, okay, I've got a business, I've registered it, I need to have a playbook in case anything goes wrong.
When we advise startup businesses, we tell them you should have a business plan, you should have a marketing plan. It probably isn't a bad idea to have a strategy for this stuff right from the outset.
Yeah. Let's say if you're a startup and you start taking customers' credit card details, you want to have thought through what you do if and when that gets lost. Because cyber attacks are real and small companies may be more vulnerable than large companies.
Yeah, exactly. And doubling down on this message, something that came to mind is, how about playful banter? So say, for example, you take British Airways and Virgin, or you take Audi and BMW. They've always had this kind of backwards and forwards, almost like a ribbing each other. So what are your thoughts? Yes, no, is there a hard line? Like, any advice for businesses that want to kind of have like a little bit of a nudge with picking one competition and having at it?
Well, I think that's more marketing than crisis response PR kind of stuff. But again, it has the potential to go south really quickly.
Yeah.
And, I'm pretty impressed with some of the social media posts that are coming from these brands that really do put the tongue in cheek first. I'm thinking of Wendy's, the American burger chain, that their snarky social media posts that really nothing is sacred. But they managed to stay on the right side of the line. At least so far, I haven't seen any major issues. You wonder, what's driving that? Are there PR people? Are there lawyers? Are there other folks in the messaging meetings that are figuring out what to do about this?
Yeah, there's some good psychology behind this, right? So if you're in a business, then the risk is always that there's infighting internally. Whereas if you have an external, let's say, opponent, enemy, your favorite competitor, that helps to focus on the outside. And, that's core spirit that, we're all in this together because we hate the other lot. So that is not to be underestimated. When I was at EasyJet, it was EasyJet Ryanair. Ryanair is kind of like Spirit Airlines in the in the US, very super low cost. EasyJet was value for money. We're not quite as bad as these people. One was Boeing, one was Airbus. One was Irish, one was British. Lots of themes to play on, and it gets you a lot of publicity, right? It gets you publicity. It engages the team internally, and the CEO of Ryanair even took a tank and drove it to the airport where our headquarters were. That was before my time. That was maybe around 2000 or so, before a lot of the terror attacks happened. So again, context, timing matters here. I wouldn't recommend to anyone you take a tank and drive it to an airport. That probably doesn't end well. But at the time, it was that bad. It was literally, almost militant. And when these fledgling airlines try to survive and make a profit against much bigger competitors, anything was fair game. So wouldn't do it today, but in the right context, it helps to bring people together and to get publicity that puts the company on the map.
Is there a line? Like, or is it just...
There's always a line. The line is when it's no longer useful and it backfires. And in Ryanair's case, it was, probably the tanks, but also to say, we're going to charge passengers for toilets, which, it's fine to be low cost. But then everyone said, for some reason, that is a line you couldn't cross, and passengers were in uproar and they didn't do it. But, essentially, why not charge for toilets when you charge for the bag? So where's the difference? But probably people thought this is a natural necessity or whatever, and I can, it shouldn't be charged for on the aircraft. So there's always a line when you pick rivalries. There's always a line when you think about publicity, because at some point it's no longer useful. It doesn't add to your, let's say, brand equity. It doesn't pay into your brand equity bank account. It withdraws from it. And as a communicator, you have to think about this quite hard. And when you see a lot of the brand positioning things we see these days and how it shifted in recent years, then, often these experts get it right. Sometimes they don't get it right. And I would say it's not always predictable. The world isn't as predictable as we may think. We have a hypothesis and think, okay, this can work as communicators, but there's no guarantee. The better you are, the more experienced you are, the better your hypotheses are, but it's a game of probabilities, essentially. So it's not for every company, but it does make, being a communicator a lot more fun if you can be a bit mischievous and irreverent rather than just putting out corporate press releases, for sure.
What I've heard from different business owners that I've spoken to is that there's that concern about legal cases coming back to them from like besmirching another name. And that's what's kind of stopped them from taking this like, nudge, or like, that ribbing approach. Is there concerns valid? Is there like a line for that? Or is there, what are your thoughts on approaching that?
Well, the concern about, a false statement is valid. There's never a reason to lie to the public about things. That will come back and bite you. However, there are lots of opportunities, as the Wendy's example, as the Ryanair, to spin things, being truthful but either not glib, that's not the right word, but being truthful and yet amusing about it. Yeah, this happened. Yeah, we know, or whatever it's about striking the right tone and knowing your audience. Also, who are you trying to communicate and persuade? If it's one thing if you're trying to persuade a judge or a jury. It's another if you're trying to persuade teenagers and young adult consumers, as a burger chain probably is, right? So just a lot of there's just a lot of nuance and psychology, as Oliver was saying, involved in this.
In terms of keeping your business safe, outside of having those moments and playing it along the line, right? What are other ways that businesses can ensure that they're keeping their equity safe? Now, Gordon, I know that you're focused on trademarking. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit more about that approach and making sure that you're not losing your brand equity accidentally by forgetting an element?
Yeah, well, trademark law is really about protecting the consumer. It has the side effect of protecting the brand, because what you're doing is you're helping the consumer be confident that they're not being confused by competing brands in the market. Too many similar identities in the marketplace. Now you don't really know whose product you're buying or whose service you're buying. So if we think about it through that lens of consumer protection, it gets easier, I'll say. That said, when a company does witness, as I was saying earlier, you have to police our brands. If you see someone coming in and adopting a brand that's likely to be confusing, it's incumbent on the owner of that trademark to do something about it. And sometimes that doing something looks like scorched earth, and sometimes it's that more amusing cease and desist letter, and it escalates also. Depends on how the other brand responds and those kinds of things. Protecting this is reputational stuff mostly, right? The confusion. You don't want that other terrible tasting cola coming in and confusing the public because it has the same shaped bottle as the Coca-Cola product, right? Those kinds of things. But I wouldn't say that's crisis level unless and until you're really in a knockdown, drag out legal battle in court. And then so the legal becomes the crisis.
Right.
If I can add one thing, I totally agree. And it's also to keep on top of new emerging threats. So every company now knows, okay, cyber attacks are a thing, right? That's nothing new. So we have protections, we have cybersecurity, etc. Now, what about AI and deepfakes, for instance? So we've seen that now crises can emerge from these new technologies, and criminals with lots of criminal energy use these to extort money, for scams, but also to, for instance, create, let's say, a deepfake video of the CEO where he says outrageous things. Right? So how do you deal with that? Because once it's out there, it's very hard for people to say, is this real? Is this not real? So you have to think through these very new threats and how you would actually know this is happening, and then how do you deal with that? And that's not easy, because in a way you have almost an arms race between, those who defend their reputation, those who want to damage it. But it's important to not fall behind the technological developments that can also entail these new threats.
Perfect example of this I just saw this morning. Apparently Google is indexing ChatGPT chats that people think are sort of private. You're putting in your own data into the chat to ask for input or output, and all of a sudden now it's available to anybody out there in the public. Another component of this is that your ChatGPT logs are discoverable evidence in court. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, okay. So this is the kind of thing that I think OpenAI is going to be responding pretty quickly with a PR team.
Oh, that is hella dangerous. And another thing I noticed for business owners, especially with this naming, that often we're so focused on securing, okay, we're just going to be on, say, for example, LinkedIn and YouTube. But they forget to secure that name on other platforms, regardless of whether they're going to be using it or not. And then later on, somebody takes that name, say, for example, be it on Instagram or Facebook, and they start promoting something else, or they start, spamming that account. And, people who believe that is the same brand, it's already taken. They can't, take that again, or it's going to be very expensive to take that again. That then becomes a problem. Instead of being like, I'm, for example, Badassery by B on all these platforms and putting the logo, then you have to change it. I'm Badassery by B 41 on Instagram. Right?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And we see this now that, so for instance, Sam Altman also said that, if you use ChatGPT as your healthcare professional, as your mental health professional, also that is not under any confidentiality agreement like you would expect with a real therapist or doctor, of course. So there's that element as well. But I think this is also, A, it's good to understand for us. B, it's an opening for other businesses that say, hey, we're going to specialize in the mental health field, and we're going to offer something in this space and make sure this is totally confidential. That's going to be actually differentiated between us and your ChatGPT project. So there's a lot in that as well that we still have to understand, and which is of course also fast moving in terms of the technology. And I think AI, when you think about it, AI offers so many upsides, but also so many crisis touch points, if you like. So for instance, some companies have laid off significant numbers of people because of AI. Sometimes they say it's because of AI, sometimes they don't. They just say it's because of recession or whatever. So there's clearly something that we have to be mindful of, and I think because people react in a certain way to this, right? If technology takes over your job, that is very fearful for a lot of people, and you have to be very careful how you keep the rest of the team motivated, but also, of course, how do customers and stakeholders on board. So there's an AI touch point. And there are many more, so we could go on and on and on. But I think there's a new threat level, there's a new category of threats that any company, even those who think, oh, we're actually quite well prepared, we've done, been through lots of crises over the years, be mindful that there are always new threats, and don't confuse times of crises with an actual crisis. Times of crisis is, oh, we have COVID, everyone is affected, no one cares about you, everyone thinks about themselves. Whereas a crisis only affects that particular business, and all the attention is on the business. So there's a huge difference. Like, oh, we've been through COVID, we're crisis proof. No. That wasn't a crisis that affected you. That was a general crisis. Totally different thing.
Another thing that I see come up for businesses, and it's something that they often don't expect because they go in very quickly. It's like, hey, you're my mate. Like we get along. Let's partner for this business idea. And a year down the track, 2 years down the track, because there was no contract, there was nothing in writing. Things just go up in flames. Or even in terms of collaborations, a different kind of partnership. There's no clear definition. There's no clear distinction. And things like, say, for example, with Bud Light, right? Like where they're hiring, working with a partner that wasn't a complete fit. What are your recommendations in terms of avoiding situations like those for different kinds of partnerships?
If I may take it, I will say a lot of those problems arise from the lack of an agreement, the lack of a contract, the lack of clarity about what the relationship is in the first place, and sometimes the lack of due diligence in choosing the partners in the first place. So I guess the best way to avoid these problems is all of that. Do your due diligence, identify the goal, and then make sure that the partnership, this collaboration, is going to fit and help you achieve that goal. And then really document not just what the parties are going to do, but what you're going to do if things don't go right. In the podcasting space, I often advocate that new creators, and it's very easy for 2 or 3 people to come together and make a podcast and just go for it. And then 10, 20 episodes in, they have a disagreement and it leads to the end of the whole relationship and the whole thing crashes and burns right as they're gaining some momentum and maybe getting some attention. So I advocate for having what I call a podcast prenup, just sort of a written collaboration agreement that outlines the nature of the relationship, the responsibilities of the parties, and the what if, who gets the house and kids if we break up. And often the audience is the kids in that equation. So how do the others get to remain in touch with that audience, perhaps? There's all kinds of, we don't have to get specific about podcasts, but it's a sort of good fences make good neighbors approach to things. Good contracts make good partners. And absence of contracts is usually what leads to those disputes and disagreements.
Yeah, and it happens in founder teams as well, that the founders fall out of disagreements, which has a huge impact on the business, often splits the company in the middle. You have loyalists, and all of a sudden it's no longer about the business and the customer. All attention turns inward, and you may have a prenup internally. But what I always advise is, okay, obviously you don't want this to happen in the first place. So if you're building a business together and you're in this very stressful situation, you're working 80-hour weeks, you're sleeping on mattresses, you're putting it all in, of course, emotions run high. Everyone is fully invested. And in those sorts of environments, crises can emerge because people are tired, have a short fuse, everything is at stake. So what I say is, look, you need to have quality, like a couple, right? You need to have some quality, you need a date night, essentially, between you founders. Let's say it's 3 people, go for pizza on Thursdays, right? Whatever, Taco Tuesday, what doesn't matter, right? Don't have an agenda, get out of the office, grab a beer, and just talk. And just say, I thought this was cool. To be honest, this thing bothered me. Maybe you could not do this in front of the team. So, yeah, you're right, that wasn't cool. So these things clear the air before these crises emerge, and, then people like Gordon and I have to get involved, and
often
no one wants this. So there's often, like in a romantic relationship between founders, between podcast hosts, think this through, have things in place that put things in writing, but then have these sort of date nights in a way and clear the air.
Yeah, often as not, these issues don't come down to what the document says or what the plan or even the playbook says. It's often just the act of having done the planning. You're working the muscles that don't often get worked. And so when the need for those arises, the muscles are fit and ready to go. So that early communication and continuing communication really is important.
Are there any areas where you've seen that business owners have missed a gap in these kinds of contracts that later it fell through that, others should have?
Well, of course, it's never happened with me and the contracts I've drawn up.
When they come to you after, they're like, "Oh man, I'm messed up. Like I did a contract, but
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes someone just fails to anticipate something that maybe a more objective point of view would have seen, but as often as not, I think if it gets overlooked by the people who are inside and closest to the business, it's probably not going to bubble to the surface for outsiders either until it becomes a problem. So yes, it happens all the time, and the best you can do is, again, having done the exercise of planning and thinking it through, often that creates a greater agility and ability to respond accordingly.
are there certain areas that you should be looking at, like to make sure that this is in there?
I mean, I think it varies depending on the nature of the deal and the nature of the relationship. In business transactions, partnerships and collaborations, it's often maybe an internal crisis at one of the partner companies bleeds over into the relationship, and they're no longer able to do what they said they were going to do, and sometimes it's about giving parties just a graceful way out, rather than accusing everybody of breach and pointing. I'm actually dealing with one right now where the parties are pointing fingers at each other over who didn't do what they were supposed to do, and meanwhile the whole enterprise is in a suspended mode and not doing anyone any good. So yeah, I guess it really depends on what are the deliverables in the deal, who's supposed to do what, that you can start to anticipate. Well, but what if this happens? What if they're prevented by this, or if oftentimes it's a force majeure event, some kind of a flood or a tsunami or earthquake or something, or a pandemic, right? That these things make it hard for people to do what they've promised to do in anticipation. So, I sort of think of that force majeure clause as the giving each other grace when bad things happen. Although often you're invoking it as hey, I'm okay. I didn't do anything wrong. We know.
So making sure that we're going into enough detail. Okay, so this is your part. These are the things that you're going to cover, and if that changes, coming back to that and updating it.
I mean, contract precision is always the best approach. An agreement to agree later, or a generalization doesn't get us very far. It's really trying to, we have to anticipate as many scenarios as we can, but then you also anticipate the possibility that we didn't anticipate something, and clever drafting can sometimes help in that arena.
Have you had any experiences with those, Oliver? Or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe to throw in another dimension to these contracts. So I was part of a legal dispute at EasyJet with the founder. I can talk about it because it was in the High Court and it was all over the media. So this is public knowledge. But what happened is that when the company was set up by the founder, before it was listed at the stock market, there was a licensing agreement about the brand, and the airline paid the founder £1 a year to use the brand. And when the company became big and successful, the founder said, hang on a second, that's worth more than £1, but the contract said £1. So he didn't own the majority anymore. That would have been easy. We're just going to change this. But he had a significant minority share, which meant you could make life very difficult on the board for management, but he couldn't determine it. And you had this tug of war that went on for months and months and ended up in the High Court. And in the end, it was settled as he had, because you still have to live with each other, right? You still... it's like two countries, right? You live with your neighbors, you have to coexist in the future. So at some point you just have to say, okay, we have to sort this out. But it was nasty AF, big legal teams, big PR teams. As I said, it ended up in the highest court in the country. So it was pretty nasty. So there's the legal side, and then there's the power plays that sometimes get played to say, yeah, I know what it says, but it shouldn't say that from now on. And then you have that essentially a different sort of conversation that is still half legal, but also half, like, say, publicity and power play.
See, that's interesting. The lawyer in that example, the lawyer in me says, wait a minute, he made a deal with himself that didn't include, and why would he think of it? Didn't include a termination or an expiration time frame. And so he was sort of stuck with sleeping in the bed he made until he was able to.
Yeah. Absolutely, and you know, the rough and tumble of launching a business where those just put something in place, and the brand was designed by some local shop around the corner for $400, and the server was under the CEO's desk, and all these failure points that 10 years later is like, oh my god, how could this happen?
Well,
but at the beginning you don't know if you survive until tomorrow, so it's
Right.
kind of what happens in 10 years. I'm worried about Tuesday.
Oh my gosh, that is intense. So, I mean, you guys have mentioned about these legal battles. You've talked about when there's so much going on, there's so much intensity that the operations halt. Are there ways that this can be leveraged, or this can be turned around, or like how this can be approached by the rest of the team so that it's not affecting the brand as much?
Part of me thinks, well, just non-disclosure agreements, make sure everybody keeps mum about things. But as Oliver said right at the beginning, is sometimes that deny, deflect. What was the third D?
Deny, deflect, diminish, deny, deflect.
Right. That's not going to play well either. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's just, you got to let it play out, and you do the best you can, and you approach it in a way that's going to put the best face forward, I guess.
Yeah, some things can't be solved; they can only be managed.
So if there's something, happening, legal proceeding or whatever, would it make it worse if there's a PR team or, your communications and marketing still putting out regular marketing, or if they're talking about that event, what are your recommendations there?
So usually you stop any marketing PR messages when a crisis hits. You just press pause, and after a while, once you deal with the immediate crisis, then you return to them and say, okay, when would be a good time to restart our customer newsletters? But that's an important part of any playbook, to say stop. Because the last thing you want to do is, like, you had a terrible accident and you say, hey, book our summer flights, $29.99. That is a terrible idea, right? It happened. There are some cases where that actually happened. So stop marketing messages, return to this question when the time is right. And, there's a good segue to another question. What do you do when the crisis is over, right? Because the acute crisis may be over, but then you think, okay, we have to actually rebuild the brand. We have to rebuild trust. So this is an important part as well. So when you think about crisis, think about the before, anticipation, preparation, etc., the during, and then the after. And don't forget about the after. Take stock what went well in a crisis, what didn't go well, and then also how do you continue to rebuild trust in the aftermath.
Are there any specific techniques that you would recommend for the after?
It comes down to trust, right? So, and there's an interesting thing about the psychology of trust. Trust rests on a couple of pillars. One is competence, one is benevolence, and one is integrity. And what you want to do is that the crisis ideally was triggered by a mistake. In other words, competence. Everyone makes mistakes. As long as we own our mistakes, people forgive us, and the aftermath is actually relatively simple. Say, okay, they figured out what went wrong and they fixed it. Cool. Life goes on. And you can actually enhance, as we said, enhance your reputation. Now, if people think integrity was the issue, you lied, for instance, or dishonesty, unethical behavior. Now, that is a different level of problem. Same with benevolence, i.e., do I create win-win situation between me and the customer and the stakeholders, or is it just selfish? So integrity and selfishness are not as easily forgiven as a mistake, an honest mistake. So in crisis communications, what you try to do is essentially always position something as a competence problem, not as an integrity or honesty or ethical problem, because that is easier to overcome, and then the aftermath is easier. Now, if you screwed that up, often it means you have to change the leadership, right? Because you have to separate who's the villain. It comes back to this question: who's the villain in the story? It's the CEO, so the CEO has to go. right? And
Yeah.
think about Uber. Uber is the classic example for this. Travis Kalanick became the villain, or was made the villain by the board in order to protect the future of Uber. And a clean-cut CEO was brought in, who was, very different type of leader. And the reason they did this, and this wasn't easy because he was his major shareholder, founder, the face of the company, is because they concluded that he does more harm to the brand than good. And the brand at the end of the day is the business, right? In a case like this, because there's, they don't own any cars or anything. So if people hate the brand, that may be the end of Uber. So that's what you did. So essentially the crisis couldn't be solved by these means. People thought it's a nasty company. So the villain was no longer made the company, but the CEO, who had to leave. And this is the kind of fresh start with fresh leadership that sometimes resolves the problem in the aftermath.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly sounds like focusing on the internal parts of the business rather than, say, for example, you've gone through a crisis and maybe you're a bit roughed up. And you're like, oh, well, maybe we should change our logo so people lose that that negative association. But
it can be the customer. So if so let's say, I have a founder of the podcast. He had a problem with shipments in the US, and they were stuck in customs, whatever. He couldn't get stuff to the customers. 10,000 customers unhappy because China tariffs under Trump 1 administration. So things were just stuck in the harbor. Well, his ratings went down to 1 star, which is almost unheard of, almost impossible to get to, that hated as a brand. It was no fault of his own, right? But he went out of his way with the business to be customer centric, to explain what happened, to make good on the promises, to deliver these goods, etc., etc. So they're completely customer focused because it was a customer centric crisis. That way they dug themselves out of that hole, and a few years later, obviously, had recovered, and things regress to the mean, fortunately, also when it comes to 5-star ratings. So it depends what the crisis is, and therefore what the solution will be determined by the crisis, essentially. But that would be an example where it's all about the customer, because you need your customers to trust you.
I mean, hell, one could argue most businesses, if not all businesses, it should be customer centric, right? We're making sure that they're okay with it and that we're not just moving onwards and forgetting about okay, this just happened.
In an ideal world, but many customers are shareholder centric, not customer centric. Not naming names here, but that exists.
All right. So there is one question that I ask everybody that comes on to the show since season 1 until now. And the answer doesn't need to relate to the topic of this specific episode. The question is, what is one societal or social norm that you want to push back against and help society change that?
Yeah, that's a great point. I love that, Gordon. And it's better to be us against the problem than us against them, for sure. Yeah. So for me, I would love people to be more open to change. And I say this maybe from a European perspective. In Germany, we perfected the analog world of cars, washing machines, chemicals, and so on. So perfect. However, we live in a digital age, and many things can be done better, more efficiently, more customer friendly, more citizen friendly with technology. And I would hope that people around Europe, the people I talk to every day, that we become a little more open to change. Because I think if we change these things, they're not actually that relevant, but make things easier, we can actually keep the good things going that really matter. If we don't allow change in these small procedural things, I'm afraid that big things will change and we won't like it. So change just be open-minded about change, because I think people tend to emotionally reject change. And I get it why. It's deeply ingrained. Change is always risky for us as humans. But rationally, we can look at something and say, is this a good idea or is it not a good idea, right? And be open-minded about change.
Wow. Those are two very incredible impacts that hopefully we get around to
You
doing
ask deep
something
questions, you
about
get deep
that.
answers.
What's mine? Well, it's the reason I ask that question every time. I want to push back on these social norms. I want to push back on the shoulds. There's so many shoulds, be it personally, be it in business, that we've become so accustomed to doing them that no one's really pushing back on it. No one's really thinking on it. And I wanna poke the bear there. And that's why I asked this question, so that maybe you guys will talk about it more. Like after this episode, you'll continue bring this up, and then there'll be some changes. There'll be some pushback against all these shoulds, all these norms, which shouldn't technically be norms. That's true. I mean, we've been, associated or learned these things as we've been growing up, because as a kid, a lot of these things were not there before school. But then there was school. We got taught this is the certain way, and then that's being sustained by the people around us and the people around them. And it doesn't need a law to go and be like, you should go and get married. You should go and have 2.5 kids like that. That's right. No, it's people around us that's leading to that. So thank you so much, Oliver and Gordon. That was hella deep. Reach out to them and catch that deal for an access in the episode description. And to you, my badass listener, thanks for tuning in. And if you love this episode, a 5-star review goes a long way. Now, let's go get badass.
No more excuses. No more branding band-aids. The art of positioning. Let's freaking go.
So, I mean, back to our cat versus dog conversation. I feel like I'm the only one here that's a dog girl.
Yes.
I've got 3 cats and 2 dogs, so and 3 children and a wife, so it's a menagerie around here.
Do you need other animals? Are you collecting?
No, I have put my foot down. This is it.
The kids are like, well, how about a spider? Or I'm like, no.
Well, it's funny. About a year ago, we had 4 cats and 1 dog, and we had made a decision that one of the cats needed to be rehomed. She just wasn't happy in this environment. And as soon as we made those arrangements, and before we had actually moved her, the second dog came into our life, and so it just okay, that's enough. I had to put my foot down.